Welcome back, dear listener. Tonight, we continue our quiet journey into a moment in history that lasted only minutes, yet changed an entire world. Often measures wars in years, sometimes decades. They stretch across maps, rewrite borders, and leave behind echoes that never truly fade. But once, just once, the world witnessed a war so brief that by the time the sun had crossed the morning sky, it was already over. A war that began and ended before the tea in a brass pot had cooled. A war that lasted only 38 minutes. This is that story. The island of Zanzibar in the late 19th century was a jewel upon the Indian Ocean, a place of spice and song, of traders and travelers, of markets heavy with cinnamon and clove. For centuries, it had been a crossroads of empires, Persian, Arab, African, and now European. Its air smelled of salt and sweetness. Its harbors were filled with the creak of dhows, those elegant wooden ships with white sails curved like the wings of birds. And rising above the harbor stood the Sultan's palace, gleaming in the heat, pale coral stone and carved doors so intricate that light itself seemed to pause to admire them. The Sultan was Hamad bin Thuani, a ruler of quiet dignity. He had taken the throne in 1893 and was known to be a friend to the British, for in those days, Zanzibar, though proud and independent, lived under the heavy shadow of the British Empire. Britain had influence here, a subtle kind at first, but unmistakable. Their flag fluttered near the docks. Their officers strolled the gardens in white uniforms, and their gunboats watched from the bay with eyes of iron and steam. But for the most part, there was peace. Trade flowed, the people worked, and the Sultan smiled. Until on the morning of August 25th, 1896, the Sultan did not wake. He died quietly in his sleep. Some said of illness, some whispered of poison, others of a heart that had simply grown too weary of the heat. The palace fell into confusion. Drums beat through the city. Messengers ran barefoot through the alleys. The throne of Zanzibar was empty, and as every historian knows, an empty throne does not stay empty for long. By that same afternoon, another man, Khalid bin Barkash, the Sultan's cousin, rode through the palace gates with purpose burning behind his eyes. He was young, ambitious, and restless. He believed, as many in the palace did, that the throne should have been his all along. He was also, as the British quickly discovered, not the kind of man they could control. Khalid's men unfurled his banner above the palace, red and gold silk, bright against the sky. Cannons were rolled into the courtyard. Soldiers, nearly 3,000 Zanzibaris, assembled at his call. Loyal to him through family ties and promises whispered in the dark. And by sunset, the Union Jack, the British flag, no longer flew beside the palace. It was a small act, but to the British consul, Basil Cave, it was the first sign of rebellion. In London, that might have been just an insult. In Zanzibar, it was war. That evening, the British sent a message, polite, almost painfully polite. It read, "His Highness Khalid bin Barkash has no right to the throne without the consent of Her Majesty's government. Should he continue to occupy the palace, we shall be obliged to take such steps as may be necessary." A diplomatic way of saying, you have until morning to surrender. But Khalid, seated on the marble steps of the palace, refused to leave. He had soldiers, he had cannons, he had pride, and perhaps, most dangerously, he had hope. The kind of hope that blinds a man to the shape of a storm gathering over his head. Out in the harbor, 5 British warships floated in the silver water. Their names were HM St. George, HMS Philomel, FMS Raccoon, HMS Rash. Their decks gleamed with polished brass. Their cannons pointed quietly toward the palace, their barrels dark and patient. Their crews were small, a few hundred sailors and marines, but their power was absolute. Steam and steel against stone and muskets. Zanzibar was a beautiful island, yes, but it was not prepared for a war. Night fell softly over the coral coast. The lamps of the palace glowed like fireflies. The waves whispered against the shore, and in the harbor, the warships rocked gently, waiting. Inside his chambers, Khalid paced. Advisors begged him to speak with the British, to find a way to avoid what everyone knew was coming, but he refused. He told them, quietly but firmly, that a Sultan of Zanzibar does not flee his throne. He had inherited not only the palace, but centuries of pride. He believed, as many rulers before him had believed, that right was stronger than artillery. And as the night deepened, the stars over Zanzibar burned quietly, unaware that by the time they faded, an entire kingdom would fall. At dawn on August 27th, the harbor was painted gold. Steam hissed, the British ships stirred, their flags unfurled, and the horns of their signalmen echoed across the still air. From the deck of HMS St. George, Rear Admiral Harry Rawson watched through his spyglass, waiting for the answer he already knew would not come. In his hand, he held the final ultimatum. If you do not lower your flag and leave the palace by 9 a.m., we will open fire. The message was sent ashore. A young messenger, trembling, ran through the heat and dust toward the gates. He was met by Khalid's guards, their muskets gleaming, their faces uncertain. He was allowed in, and moments later, allowed out. He carried Khalid's reply, 4 words that would decide the fate of a kingdom. We will not yield. The clock on St. George struck 8:30. 30 minutes left. The harbor was silent but alive. You could feel the tension in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks open. Fishermen pulled their boats ashore. Children hid behind shuttered windows. Traders stood still in the markets, watching the horizon where the iron ships waited. And the Sultan, young, defiant Khalid, walked to the balcony of his palace and looked out across his city one last time. No one knew then that in 38 minutes his world would end, but the cannons were ready. The sun was climbing, and history was already counting down. Dawn settled over Zanzibar like a warm hand upon the sea. The light was gentle, hesitant, as though even the sun feared what the morning might bring. The city woke not with its usual music of merchants and gulls, but with a kind of trembling silence, the kind that presses against the ribs like a held breath. Men stood on rooftops, shading their eyes. Women gathered near windows, their hands tighter on the frames. Children whispered, asking what the ships in the harbor were waiting for. And in the palace, once filled with the scent of incense and the echo of footsteps, all the lamps burned, even though the sky outside was brightening. Inside those walls, Sultan Khalid bin Barghash stood like a man carved from stone. The palace before the storm, he had been awake all night. Not a moment of sleep had entered his eyes. He had walked the halls, the old Persian rug soft beneath his boots, the lanterns casting gold across the coral walls, listening to the world hold still. In the courtyard, his loyal soldiers sharpened their bayonets. The palace guards rolled the brass cannons into position. Drums were prepared, though no one beat them yet. The palace musicians sat quietly with their instruments beside them, as though waiting for someone to tell them whether they would be playing at a coronation or a funeral. At the far end of the palace, a single flag fluttered, Khalid's royal standard, bright red and gold, the symbol of his claim. And beneath that flag, near the balcony overlooking the sea, Khalid stood with his hands behind his back, watching the British ships with unreadable eyes. The fleet awaits out in the harbor. The British fleet was already in formation. 5 ships, great shadows against the rising sun. The HM St. George at the center, her hull gleaming with polished steel. The HMs Thrush and HMs Sparrow flanking her sides. The HMs Raccoon and HMs Philomel watching from the deeper water. Their cannons were loaded, their flags unfurled. On the decks, sailors tightened ropes, adjusted rangefinders, and stood in lines with rigid discipline. Admiral Rawson, a man whose mustache seemed as firm as his resolve, watched the palace through a brass spyglass. He had issued the ultimatum. He had given Khalid the chance to walk away, but the deadline was approaching. 8:30 a.m., the message had been sent. 9 a.m., the guns would speak. At the British consulate nearby, Basil Cave, the British representative of Zanzibar, paced in tight circles, his face pale and drawn. He was not a man who enjoyed the idea of war. He preferred diplomacy, papers signed neatly, agreements stitched with careful words. But now, his duty forced him into a role he had never wanted. He reread the final telegram he'd sent earlier to London. The situation is serious. If Khalid does not yield, we must proceed with force. He had hoped London would tell him to wait, to delay, to negotiate further. But the reply came quickly, short and cold. You are authorized to take all necessary measures. Basil Cave swallowed. That, in the language of empire, meant war. Inside the palace walls. Meanwhile, in the palace, servants rushed through the corridors, moving furniture, reinforcing gates, trying desperately to prepare for something no one truly believed could happen. A British bombardment here? Against their beloved palace, the House of Wonders, the pride of the Sultanate. It seemed impossible, but every moment the clock ticked made the impossible feel more real. Khalid walked down the long hallway toward the palace courtyard. His boots echoed against the stone. Men rose and bowed as he passed. One of his generals approached him, a broad-shouldered man with a gray beard and eyes that held stories of many storms. Your Highness, he said quietly, the British ships, they are taking aim. Khalid nodded. I know. We are not prepared for a bombardment of this scale. We do not have the artillery. We have honor, Khalid said softly. And God willing, that will be enough. The general bowed his head, but inside his heart trembled. The last messenger at 8:55 a.m., a British dhow approached the shoreline. A single messenger stepped out, barefoot, breathing hard, carrying one final letter. The palace guards let him pass. He hurried through the gates, through the halls, to the balcony where Khalid stood. He knelt and presented the paper. Khalid took it, unfolded it with steady fingers, and read the final ultimatum. Lower your flag and leave the palace, or we will fire. He folded the letter, pressed it briefly against his chest, and handed it back. My answer is the same, he whispered. Tell them. The Sultan of Zanzibar does not surrender. The messenger ran. The guards closed the gate, and Khalid turned his eyes back to the harbor. The sun was bright now, casting a golden path across the water. Directly toward the British ships, the drums in the palace courtyard began to beat, slow, heavy, rhythmic. A sound like a heartbeat preparing for its final moments. The countdown on the bridge of HMS St. George. Admiral Rawson held his pocket watch in his palm. 8:59 a.m. Around him, the officers stood ready. Cannons loaded, gunners at their stations. The flags of signalmen lifted, their semaphores poised like silent birds. Rawson exhaled slowly. He knew what a single broadside from his ships would do. He knew the palace walls were coral and wood, beautiful, historic, but fragile. He knew innocent people would be inside, servants, guards, family, but he also knew his orders. The Empire demanded obedience, and Rawson, a man of the Royal Navy, had lived his entire life in obedience. The final moment before war in the palace, Khalid stood straighter. He placed his right hand on the hilt of his ceremonial sword, but not to draw it, simply to feel it. It was not a weapon now, it was a symbol. He looked once more at the city, at the minarets, at the spice markets, at the harbor filled with dhows and the memories of his ancestors. He whispered, to no one in particular, but perhaps to the island itself, whatever happens, let the world remember that we stood. A soft breeze lifted the Sultan's flag above him, making it snap gently against the tranquil morning sky. 9 a.m. on the deck of the St. George. Admiral Rawson closed his watch. He lifted his hand. He held it there, motionless, suspended, as the entire harbor inhaled. Every sailor held his breath. Every soldier tightened his grip. Every heart in Zanzibar froze. Rawson's hand fell. And history began its shortest war. At the exact moment the clock struck 9 a.m., the world seemed to pause. A thin, trembling silence stretched across the harbor, as if Zanzibar itself held its breath. On the decks of the British ships, men stood frozen in their positions. Hands on ropes, eyes squinting through smoke and sunlight, muscles tightened like drawn bowstrings. For a heartbeat, just one, the sea was still. The flags hung motionless. Even the gulls circling overhead stopped crying. And then a sound rolled across the water, low, heavy, ancient, the kind of sound the ocean remembers long after the ships that made it are gone. The first shot of the Anglo-Zanzibar War had been fired. The cannon's cry, the thunder bloomed from the cannon of HMS Thrush, its smoke curling into the warm morning air like a dragon's breath. The sound reached the palace half a second later, a deep, resonant boom that made the coral walls tremble and sent a flock of white doves scattering into the sky. The cannonball struck the palace courtyard, splintering stone, sending dust and fragments upward in a soft gray cloud. Inside the courtyard, Sultan Khalid's soldiers scrambled, some ducking, others loading rifles with shaking hands, others looking to their commander, waiting for the order to fire back. But Khalid did not shout. He did not run. He only inhaled slowly, deeply, and watched the ships with a calm that surprised even himself. He had known this moment would come. He had prepared for it in his heart, long before he prepared for it in his palace. The echo across the harbor on the decks of the British ships. Officers called out instructions with measured voices. No panic, no celebration, only discipline. The gunners wiped sweat from their brows. The sunlight glinted on brass. The ropes creaked softly as cannons were adjusted again. Admiral Rawson lowered his spyglass. His expression did not change. He gave the next command, his voice steady as the sea. Commenced bombardment, and the harbor erupted into thunder. The palace under fire. The palace, magnificent and fragile, with its carved wooden doors and coral walls polished by time, shook under the second volley. Cannonballs cracked through balconies and shattered the stained glass windows that had watched over Zanzibar for generations. The Sultan's soldiers fired back with old muskets and two aging brass cannons that had not been used in years. Their shots reached the water, sending small splashes into the sea. But the British ships did not flinch. Their iron hulls were unscarred, their decks steady, their artillery far stronger. A volley from HMS St. George struck the palace courtyard again, tearing through the painted wooden roof of the audience chamber. Inside, where dignitaries had once gathered in silk and gold, dust now fell like gray snow. Inside the palace, chaos and courage servants rushed through the corridors, guiding women and children into safer rooms. Guards braced fallen beams and tried to put out small fires sparked by exploding shells. And through all of it, Sultan Khalid remained at the balcony, his cloak wrapped around him like a silent, regal shadow. A young guard, barely more than a boy, ran to him and cried, "Your Highness, we must retreat. The walls won't hold." Khalid placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, steady and gentle. "We stand for as long as we can," he said. "We show the world that Zanzibar did not bend." The boy swallowed hard, nodded, and returned to his post with renewed courage in his trembling hands. The clock ticks on 9:04 a.m., 4 minutes into the war. Already the palace was shrouded in dust and smoke. Already hundreds in the city watched from alleys and windows, praying under their breath. But the British artillery was methodical, cannon by cannon, deck by deck. They aimed not at the city, but only at the palace and the small cluster of defenses surrounding it. On HM's Raccoon, A young signalman recorded the time of each volley in a neat, steady script, as though documenting a ceremony rather than a war. The Sultan's band in one of history's strangest and most poetic moments. Sultan Khalid's royal band, a group of musicians dressed in white linen and red sashes, took their place in the palace courtyard. Their instruments glowed faintly through the smoke, drums, flutes, a brass trumpet that had seen many ceremonies. And as the bombardment continued, they played a national anthem, soft, wavering, defiant, a melody carried on air thick with dust, fragile as silk, brave as fire. Some British sailors later wrote in their diaries that they could hear the music drifting across the water between cannon blasts. They described it as a sorrowful, beautiful sound, a sound that would haunt them long after the war ended. The flag that would not fall by 9:09 a.m., the palace was heavily damaged. The roof of the audience chamber had collapsed. The windows were shattered. Fire licked along the beams, but the Sultan's red and gold flag still flew above the central tower. Tattered by smoke, whipped by wind, it clung to its pole like a heartbeat refusing to stop. British officers took note. As long as the flag remained, they considered the Sultan to be resisting. And so, the bombardment continued. A city holds its breath. The people of Zanzibar crowded the streets, some crying, some silent, some praying loud. Fathers shielded their children. Mothers whispered reassurances they did not believe. Elders shook their heads as if witnessing a storm that had been foretold but never prepared for. The city itself, with its spice markets, its narrow stone alleys, its turquoise doorways and hanging lanterns, seemed to tremble with every distant boom. But the people did not flee. They watched their history burn because it was all they could do. At 9:15 a.m., 15 minutes into the war, the palace walls were breaking. Smoke curled into the sky in soft gray ribbons. The royal band still played, though some instruments had fallen silent. And Sultan Khalid, his cloak covered in dust, still stood upright, watching the harbor as though the sea might offer him one final miracle. The British guns continued their rhythm, precise, relentless, like a drumbeat of empire. And the war, though only minutes old, had already begun to slip into legend. The bombardment continued with a strange, dreamlike rhythm, almost slow, almost soft, as if time itself had thickened in the heat of the morning. Though the British guns were thunder, the world around them seemed muted, wrapped in a haze of dust and the steady pulse of the ocean against the harbor wall. Zanzibar was awake, but not in the way a city truly wakes. It was awake in fear and disbelief, in the surreal quiet that comes when a moment becomes greater than the people living it. The war had lasted barely 15 minutes, and yet it already felt like an era. The House of Wonders, at the heart of the palace complex, stood a building known throughout East Africa as Beit al-Ajaib, the House of Wonders. It was called this not for magic, but for its architecture: 3 stories of coral stone, grand balconies, hundreds of carved windows, all built with the help of traders and craftsmen from faraway lands. It was the first building in Zanzibar to have electric lights, a marvel that made visitors gasp the first time its balconies glowed like lanterns in the night. But now, those same balconies shivered under the weight of cannon fire, wood shattered, stone cracked. Dust drifted like gray feathers. Across the courtyard below, inside the House of Wonders, rooms once filled with perfumes and silk were now clouded with smoke. Servants moved like shadows, leading the royal family deeper into the inner chambers where the walls were thickest. And upstairs, on the highest balcony of all, the Sultan's flag still clung to the morning breeze. Inside the audience hall, in the vast audience hall, once decorated with flowing curtains and pillars of white marble, a section of the ceiling gave way with a deep groan that echoed like thunder. A rain of plaster and wood crashed onto the mosaic floor, scattering shards across the velvet carpets. The Sultan's advisors rushed to help the wounded, lifting men to their feet, wrapping torn sleeves around bleeding arms, calling for water that never arrived quickly enough. One advisor, an elderly man named Hamd, who had served 3 sultans before Khalid, approached the young ruler with desperation in his eyes. "Your Highness," he whispered, "we must leave the palace. The walls cannot withstand this." Khalid looked at him with surprising gentleness. "Old friend," he said softly, "I promised myself I would not abandon this throne in the face of foreign fire. But your Highness," Hamd pressed, "a throne can be rebuilt, a life cannot." Khalid closed his eyes. A breath moved through him, slow, heavy, ancient. He did not answer, but he looked outward toward the harbor, where the ships continued their steady assault. The British observation on HMS St. George, Admiral Rawson stood with his officers beneath a cloud of thickening smoke. Through his spyglass, he could see that the palace had been struck dozens of times. He could see splintered beams, collapsed archways, puffs of dust rising with every impact. Yet one sight held his attention more than any other: the Sultan's flag. Still flying. Tattered, yes. Its edges burned and frayed, but still standing. Rawson lowered the spyglass, his jaw tightening. "The flag remains," an officer said quietly. "They have not surrendered?" Rawson nodded once. "Then we continue." He gave the signal. And once more, the British gun spoke. A city in shock, down in the narrow stone streets of Zanzibar town. People gathered in clusters, their faces turned to the palace, as each impact sent tremors through the ground. Mothers held their children close. Fathers whispered prayers under their breath. Merchants stood before their shops, unable to decide whether to open or shutter their doors, in a moment where commerce felt like a forgotten language. Old fishermen, their hands calloused from years of rope and salt, shook their heads slowly as they watched the sky fill with smoke. One of them murmured, "I have seen storms, but never one that rose from the sea without clouds." Farther down the market road, the imam from the local mosque stepped outside with his prayer beads in hand. He gazed toward the palace, eyes shining not with fear but with sadness. "It is a morning," he whispered, "that will be remembered, long after the sea forgets the footprints of the ships." The palace defenders inside the courtyard, Zanzibar's defenders, continued their futile resistance. Their antiquated cannons fired sporadically, each shot sending a puff of white smoke up into the blur of gray and orange above. The recoil knocked some men backward as their hands shook with fear and adrenaline. But they fired again, and again. Their courage was as desperate as it was noble. The palace musicians, the strange, tragic poetry of this war had mostly fallen silent now. But one man remained, a flutist with trembling lips and eyes full of stubborn pride. He pressed the flute to his mouth and played the final notes of the Zanzibari anthem as the courtyard filled with dust. The tune was faint, barely more than breath, but it carried. Even the British sailors heard it, a fragile melody floating across the sea like a ghost of the world that was being destroyed. One sailor whispered, "God help them. They're still playing." The fall of the tower at 9:26 a.m. After 26 minutes of bombardment, a massive shell from HMS St. George struck the central tower of the palace. A deep crack split through the stone like lightning. Dust burst into the air. Wood snapped. And slowly, almost gracefully, the upper portion of the tower collapsed in a great sigh of stone and smoke. A shockwave rippled outward, sending guards sprawling across the courtyard. When the dust cleared, a single heartbreaking detail remained. The flagpole was leaning, bent, barely standing. But the flag, the red and gold symbol of Khalid's defiance, still clung to its place. Even broken, it refused to fall. Khalid's resolve from the balcony, Sultan Khalid watched the tower collapse as if witnessing the fall of a friend. His face stayed still, but something in his eyes cracked, a small, silent fracture only visible to those who knew him well. General Side, his most trusted officer, approached him with urgency. "Your Highness, we must retreat to the palace gardens. The interior has become too dangerous." Khalid did not move. Instead, he whispered, "Not yet. Not while the flag still stands." General Saad bowed his head, accepting the decision even though he feared it. The British close and the British ships moved slightly closer, closing the circle like a tightening fist. Their cannons were hotter now, their barrels darkened with soot. Sailors poured water over them to cool the metal before loading the next round. Every sound was controlled, every step calculated. This was not chaos. This was precision, the machinery of empire, and yet, despite the discipline, several sailors looked toward the palace with unease. War was one thing. Bombarding a palace in a quiet island city was another. One young officer whispered a prayer before giving the order to fire again. The palace-burned smoke began to rise from the eastern wing of the palace. Slow at first, thin wisps drifting lazily into the sky. Then thicker, redder, alive. Flames licked at the carved wooden balconies, hungry and bright. Servants rushed with buckets, their movements frantic but brave. Every bucket was too little. Every second too late. The House of Wonders, for the first time in its life, was burning. Through the haze, Khalid saw it. His breath caught. His hand gripped the balcony railing. Just below the rising flames, the palace's great ceremonial door, intricately carved with verses, flowers, and ancient patterns, glowed in the heat as though the wood itself was remembering every hand that had touched it over the centuries. The palace wasn't just stone and timber, it was memory. And the memory was dying. 9:30 a.m., 30 minutes into the war. Only 8 minutes remained before the shortest war in human history would come to its end. But in these 8 minutes, the palace would face its darkest fire. And the flag, torn, burning at its edges, still waved against the sky in a final defiance that even the British admiral could not help but respect. The end was coming. But the spirit of Zanzibar had not bowed. Not yet. Smoke drifted across the palace courtyard in long, ghost-like ribbons. The air tasted of dust and heat, of burning wood, and something quieter. A kind of sorrow that does not shout, but settles quietly in the chest and refuses to leave. The bombardment had lasted half an hour now. Only 8 minutes remained before the war that should never have been would come to its inevitable end. But those 8 minutes would carve themselves into history forever. The palace in ruins, the House of Wonders, once a marvel of lamps and balconies and carved wooden doors, now stood wounded. Its eastern wing burned with a hungry fire. Its upper floors sagged under the weight of broken beams. Glass crunched under the boots of soldiers as they moved through the smoke-filled halls, seeking wounded men, and any child or servant left behind. The royal courtyard, where musicians had played only minutes before, was now a place of silence. Shattered columns, fallen instruments, dust that moved like breath across the tiles. One of the royal drummers sat against a broken pillar, his drum at his feet. He lifted his hand, tapped it once, a soft, tiny sound, before he lowered his head and whispered a prayer. Over the instrument he loved, the Sultan's defiance on the balcony overlooking the harbor, Sultan Khalid still stood. His once white robe was now gray with dust, his eyes red from smoke. But his posture remained unbroken, straight as the mast of a ship riding out a storm. Below him, the defenders of the palace, some wounded, some shaking, some clutching old rifles with trembling fingers, continued their resistance even as the sky above them filled with ash. Every minute they stood was a miracle. Every shot they fired was a whisper of pride into the wind. Beside Khalid, General Said returned, breathless, face streaked with soot. "Your Highness," his voice cracked. "We have done all we can." Khalid did not look at him. His eyes were fixed on the harbor where the British ships glimmered like steel guardians of another world. "Are the people safe?" Khalid asked quietly. "The ones we could reach," Sad answered. Many have taken refuge in the stone houses near the inner market. They are frightened, but alive. Khalid nodded once, a quiet ache behind the gesture. "And the flag?" he asked. General Said lowered his head. Still standing, a small, fragile smile touched Khalid's dust-covered face. "Then we stand with it," he whispered. The British ships moved closer out in the harbor. The ships adjusted their positions. St. George drifted slightly forward, its anchors groaning softly under the tension. Sailors wiped sweat from their faces, loaded another round, and prepared for the next volley. Admiral Rawson leaned on the rail, spyglass in hand. His eyes were narrowed, not in cruelty, but in the quiet burden of a man whose actions, though sanctioned by an empire, weighed heavily on his own sense of duty. Through the glass, he saw the flag, still waving, tattered but proud. He lowered the spyglass and exhaled. His second officer approached. "Sir, the palace appears nearly destroyed." Rawson nodded. "The Sultan has not lowered his flag." Another volley was prepared. The final minutes began 9:31 a.m., 31 minutes into the war. 7 minutes remained. The British guns fired again. A shell struck the palace gate, splintering the great doors that dozens of artisans had carved by hand decades earlier. Fragments of sandalwood floated in the air like broken petals. Another shell hit the courtyard wall, sending a shockwave of dust into the audience chamber. Inside, Hamd, the elderly advisor, knelt beside a wounded guard and whispered verses of comfort into his ear. He did not hear the cannon that struck the chamber behind him. The blast threw him forward, and he collapsed beside the guard he had been tending. For a moment, the room was silent. The dust settled like the sigh of a dying century. The flag under fire at the top of the central tower, the flagpole creaked. A shell had struck its base moments earlier. Wood splintered. The iron brackets bent. The flag, its colors bruised by smoke, fluttered uncertainly as though exhausted. General Said looked up, eyes burning. "My Sultan, if the flag falls." "I know," Khalid whispered. For in the language of empire, a fallen flag was surrender. But surrender was something Khalid had never allowed himself to consider. Not yet. The people of the city gather in the narrow streets below the palace. Crowds had gathered despite the danger. Men, women, and children stared upward through gaps between stone houses as smoke curled into the sky. Some cried openly. Some held hands in silence. Some whispered, "Is the Sultan still standing?" And when someone spotted the single red and gold flag through the haze, a quiet murmur spread. "He is still there? It still flies?" Zanzibar has not bowed. Even in war, hope is stubborn. The British landing party prepares on HMS Sparrow. A landing party of Marines had assembled. Their boots were polished, their bayonets fixed, their uniforms stiff with salt and starch. Their commander, Captain Peel, watched the palace through binoculars. "The moment the flag falls," he said quietly, "we move." None of the Marines replied. Their throats were tight. Even trained soldiers feel the heaviness of witnessing history's final breath. 9:34 a.m. The shot that changed everything at 34 minutes into the war. A British shell struck the top of the palace tower. The explosion was not loud, not fierce, not dramatic. It was a dull, heavy thud, a tired sound like a drum that had been beaten too long. The flagpole trembled, tilted, and then, in a slow, heartbreaking motion, it fell. The red and gold banner slipped downward through the smoke, turning gently in the air like a wounded bird falling from a great height. It touched the palace roof, slid down its broken tiles, and came to rest in a coil of silk and ash on the stones below. For a moment, the entire city was silent. Even the cannon stopped. In that silence, Zanzibar's centuries-old independence took its final breath. The Sultan's heart breaks. Khalid watched the flag fall with a stillness so deep, it felt like the world had stopped turning. He did not cry. He did not speak. But inside him, something quiet and ancient collapsed, the weight of dignity meeting the reality of empire. General Said whispered, "Your Highness, we must go, now." Khalid closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw the Zanzibar of his childhood, the harbor, the markets, the sound of drums during festivals, the palace glowing under lanterns. And with a whisper so soft it could have been mistaken for breath, he said, "Very well." 9:35 a.m. The guns fall silent 35 minutes into the war. The British guns ceased fire. A calm settled over the harbor like a long, tired sigh. The war was not over yet, but its heart had stopped beating. When the Sultan's flag touched the stone courtyard, a deep silence washed across Zanzibar, the kind of silence that arrives after grief, heavy and breathless, wrapping itself around every heart like a mourning veil. For a moment, even the fires seemed to quiet. The smoke drifted slower, the flames bowed lower, as if paying respect to the end of an era. The war had lasted 35 minutes, and though 3 minutes remained before the gunshots ceased entirely, everyone, British and Zanzibari alike, felt something profound had ended. The House of Wonders, once a beacon of pride and innovation, now stood wounded, its balconies cracked, its carved doors blackened with soot, its great chambers filled with dust instead of poetry. And amid this ruin, Sultan Khalid took his final steps as a ruler. The Sultan's decision, General Saad placed a steadying hand on the Sultan's arm. "Your Highness," he whispered, urgent but respectful, "we must leave. The British Marines will be here momentarily." Khalid looked out over the harbor, where the British ships sat in the sunlight like silent steel juggernauts. He had defied them, stood firm against them, prayed against them. But the reality of their power now lay in the shattered courtyard below. He inhaled, a long, slow breath that filled his lungs with smoke and memory. "Said," he murmured, his voice soft as ash, "I have failed my ancestors." "No," Saad whispered fiercely, "you have honored them. You stood, you stayed. No man could do more." Khalid's eyes glistened, but the tears did not fall. He turned from the balcony. "Very well," he said quietly. "We go. The escape begins." The palace interior was a maze of broken beams, fallen drapery, and shattered stone. Servants guided the Sultan through the hidden corridors, known only to the royal household. Years earlier, one of Khalid's uncles had secretly ordered the construction of a concealed passage connecting the palace gardens to the German consulate, and it was toward this tunnel that the Sultan now walked. In the dim corridor, lit only by a few flickering lanterns, Khalid paused. He reached out and placed his hand on one of the carved coral walls. How many rulers had touched this same wall? How many ceremonies had begun in these halls? How many nights had filled this place with lantern light and laughter? He whispered a farewell under his breath, not to the building, but to the kingdom that was slipping from his grasp. The British moved in outside the moment the flag fell. The landing party aboard HMS Sparrow sprang into action. Dozens of Marines climbed into longboats, their oars churning the water into frothy white trails. Their boots thudded against the wood, their bayonets glinted in the sun, their expressions stiff with focus. Captain Peel stood at the helm, calling orders that cut cleanly through the morning air. "Steady, prepare to land. Remember your formation." The boats reached the docks within minutes. Fishermen and merchants scattered at their arrival. Children hid behind their mothers. Men stood in silence, their hands shaking but their eyes burning with the memory of the fallen flag. The Marines moved forward toward the smoking palace, the echo of their boots ringing across the cobblestones like a farewell toll. The palace falls silent back inside. The last of the palace defenders slowly lowered their weapons. Some did so with trembling hands, others with eyes full of pain. One guard, his uniform torn, his cheek bleeding, choked back a sob. "I'm sorry, my Sultan," he whispered. as if the air itself carried his apology. But Khalid was already gone. The palace, that had stood for generations as a symbol of power and pride, was now silent save for the mouthy crackle of flame and the distant creak of collapsing beams. Through the tunnel Khalid and his loyal entourage reached, the mouth of the secret passage, a narrow stone opening hidden behind a screen of palm leaves in the palace gardens. Beyond it, the tunnel stretched in darkness beneath the city, cool and damp compared to the burning palace above. General Saib lifted a lantern and stepped inside first. Khalid followed. Their footsteps echoed softly off the coral walls. The passage twisted like a vein beneath the city, carrying them toward the one place that could offer shelter, the German consulate. As they walked, Khalid felt his heart beat with a strange rhythm, a mixture of grief and the faintest flicker of hope. He did not know what the future held, but he knew the throne was lost. And yet, in the quiet of the tunnel, he whispered a vow, "I will not forget Zanzibar." The dark passage seemed to echo the words back to him. The Marines entered the palace at 9:38 a.m. The British Marines entered the palace gates. The war was officially over. Some Marines looked around at the damage with wide, stunned eyes. The palace, once a place of beauty, was now a ghost of splintered wood and drifting ash. Captain Peel approached the central courtyard. He paused a moment, watching the smoke rise from the fallen tower. "This," he whispered to himself, "is what 38 minutes can do." His men began securing the palace, tending to the wounded and extinguishing fires. On a broken stone step, one young musician still clutched a cracked flute in his hands. Captain Peel lowered his gaze, his expression hardening with the weight of the scene. War, he knew, was never glorious. The German refuge. Within the hour, Sultan Khalid and his loyal followers arrived at the German consulate. The German diplomats, though wary of British displeasure, accepted him as a refugee. For Khalid, it was not a victory, but it was survival. He looked back once from the shaded balcony of the consulate. He could see the faint outline of the palace through the rising smoke, a silhouette of memory against the brightening sky. And in that moment, he whispered a prayer for the city that had been his home, his crown, his heart. The world moves on by midday. The British raised their own flag over the smoking palace. A new sultan was appointed, one approved by the British crown, one who would agree to their conditions, one whose rule would not challenge the empire. Zanzibar's independence had ended not in years or months, but in 38 minutes. Children would grow up hearing the story as something unbelievable, a legend, a whisper, a piece of history that faded almost as soon as it began. But those who lived it would never forget. They had felt the ground tremble. They had watched the flag fall. They had seen the palace burn in the morning sun. They had lived the shortest war the world had ever known. A quiet ending in the evening, after the sun dipped low over the Indian Ocean, a warm breeze swept through Zanzibar. It carried the smell of spices, the sound of distant waves, and the memory of a flag that once stood against an empire. On that breeze, if one listened closely, very closely, they could almost hear the faint echo of the palace band playing their final notes. A soft, trembling anthem for a kingdom that had fallen but had never surrendered in spirit.